Welcome to our first History and Forms of Lyric event for this calendar year, although we've had events already for this academic year. It's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce Steve Burt, and I have, as I wrote down here, 4 reasons for taking this enormous pleasure. The first is that he's simply somebody I like a lot, so that's something. The second is his extraordinary love of poetry. And it's so extraordinary that he's one of the few humans I can imagine saying about that he loves poetry even more than I do. I'm not sure I'm willing to say that, but the fact that I'm even willing to think about saying that tells you something. The third, of course, is the quality of his work, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the fourth, which I'm very pleased with, and many people here might not know about, are his many interesting connections to the University of Chicago. But the first thing I want to do is say something about his CV. Now, when I got this thing, it was perfectly clear to me that the person who had done all this stuff must clearly be one of two things, either 110 years old, or there were in fact 3 or 4 persons named Stephen Burt who all published on poetry. And this seemed to me the more likely hypothesis. But that one person in his, I don't know exactly, early to mid-40s, should have done all this work is just astonishing. So I want to try to give you a little sense of the range of it. So we'll start with the books. His first was on Randall Jarrell and His Age back in 2002, for which he won the Warren Brooks Award for Literary Criticism. And then Forms of Youth, 20th Century Poetry and Adolescence in 2007. And then a book I'll talk about a little bit, Close Calls with Nonsense, Reading New Poetry in 2009. And then very shortly after that, another book I'll say something about called The Art of the Sonnet, a collection of essays on interesting sonnets from the Renaissance all the way up to probably a few months before the book was published with a co-author. And then he has in press now a book with the intriguing title, The Poem Is You. So we have that to look forward to in this year. But that's just sort of the beginning of things. I started to make a list of poets reviewed by Stephen Burt. What I am about to read to you is a really radical selection of the names on this list. Aaron Cunin, Rachel Zucker, Richard Powers, Ann Carson, Carl Dennis, D.A. Powell, Seamus Heaney, Frank Bedard, C. Day Wright, unfortunately just died, John Ashbery, Robert Creeley, Louise Gluck, Jory Graham, Richard Wilbur, Paul Muldoon, Adrian Rich, Linda Gregerson, Karen Volkman, Juliana Spar, Amy Clampett, Gertrude Schnackenberg, John Beer, and Michael Palmer. And I swear to you, that is a radical selection. How he has time to read all these books and write all these reviews, I don't know. But that's nothing. Other poets he's written on: Czesław Miłosz, Wallace Stevens, Randall Jarrell, of course, George Oppen. Now, those you might have expected. But then there are the surprises. Frederick Goddard Tuckerman, who for years I thought Ivor Winters had invented, but it turns out actually was a real 19th century American poet. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I mean, who writes on Longfellow? Especially someone who also writes on Karen Volkman. Alexander Pope, John Milton, and last but not least, John Donne, on whom I was happy to discover Steve has published 2 essays. But again, that just starts to give you a sense of the productivity of the team that goes under the name Stephen Burt. So my next list, which is just a radical shortening of essays and whatnot, I thought I would just list only the essays that appear in things that are called companions, handbooks, and encyclopedias, and that sort of thing. Post-colonial poetry and form in the Cambridge Companion to Post-Colonial Poetry, forthcoming. Mid-century modernism in the Cambridge Companion to Modern American Poetry. The mainstream and the movement in the Blackwell Companion to 20th Century British and Irish Poetry. American poetry at the end of the millennium in the Cambridge History of American Poetry, of which he's one of the editors. And then Refrain in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. Poetry Crosses the Ocean in A New Literary History of America. Scenic or topographical poetry in A Companion to Poetic Genre. And I really am sticking to these kinds of things. The contemporary sonnet in the Cambridge Companion to the Sonnet. Poetry in the New Criticism in the Blackwell Companion, it's not just Cambridge, in the Blackwell Companion to 20th Century Poetry. And then finally, and here we have him again, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, along with James Russell Lowell and Carl Shapiro in the Encyclopedia of American War Literature. Now that's just a sample, just a way of identifying a body of criticism. Now, I won't even attempt to go through the whole rest of the list, but I thought I might mention some articles with wonderful titles. Of course, Close Calls with Nonsense, which became the title of his book, How to Read and Perhaps Enjoy Very New Poetry, and Close Calls with Nonsense is available over here from the Seminary Co-op, along with Belmont, a collection of poems, and the collection of essays on sonnets. So those are all available right here from the Seminary Co-op person. And here's a pretty good title, Like, a speculative essay about poetry, simile, artificial intelligence, mourning with a U, sex, rock and roll, grammar, and romantic love. That's not all. William Shakespeare, Alan Turing, Ray Armantrout, Nick Hornby, Walt Whitman, William Carlos Williams, Leah Porpora, and Claire Danes. That's one piece. The body of the poem on transgender poetics. Here's one, it's a slightly nasty one. The Call of the Mild on Carl Dennis.
An editor's title, I didn't choose to call that.
Pretty good. Well, it's a smart editor. And then here's one that starts suggesting some of Steve's connections to our place. Do we need academic criticism in the Chicago Review in 2010? How to teach difficult poetry and why it might not be difficult after all. Maybe my favorite title, My Life as a Girl. And then Must Poets Write, another intriguing title. Our Poems Ourselves. Does autobiography make good poetry? And then again, last but not least, Portability, or the traveling uses of a poetic idea, in Modern Philology back in 2002, even before I was editor of Modern Philology. I want to talk a little bit about the work that Steve has done for Modern Philology. It's just some of his really richest essays. We've had the pleasure of publishing, and we'll be publishing his review, a review essay on the Lyric Theory collection in our next issue in February 2016. And so keep an eye out for that. It's really, it's a wonderful, very level-headed piece on, as all of you know, a very controversial set of positions about the history of lyric poetry. The other two major pieces in Modern Philology that I did have the pleasure of publishing myself is an essay in our Poetics issue, which has a wonderful cover by the sculptor Herbert George. You might want to come up and look at it. This is a portrait of Gertrude Stein. It's an essay that seems to me typical of Steve's work. Aside from its astonishing range and wonderfully lucid and unpretentious prose, the quality I want to talk about is its seriousness. That this is a very lighthearted man with a sense of humor, but who really is serious about the study of poetry, and even serious about how not to be too serious about the study of poetry, which the little introduction to Close Calls with Nonsense does a beautiful job with. The essay in the Poetics issue of Modern Philology is is the kind of thing that I think only he could do. He noticed through his amazingly wide reading into contemporary poetry that for some reason everyone was writing sestinas, that the sestinas seemed to be everywhere. So, I mean, I think it'd be enough for a critical essay just to notice this and talk about a few of them. But what's interesting about this essay is he tries to think about, what does this mean? What does this mean? Why would contemporary poets, some of whom have something close to disdain for traditional poetry in many ways, pick up this most impossible and traditional of forms? And he has, I won't give away the punchline, but he has a really interesting and thoughtful and I think quite convincing answer to this question about what does this mean? He has a response in the same issue. He has a response to our own Jennifer Scapitone, which is a meditation on what certain kinds of artistic and social critique might actually mean for readers who respond to them. And again, it's a very thoughtful piece. The other piece I want to mention is a really remarkable essay on a critic we both admire enormously, William Empson. It's an essay called Empson and the Censors, also in Modern Philology. What's amazing about this essay is that it tries to cover the whole body of Empson's work. And I don't know how many of you know that Empson was quite an important poet as well as critic. So this goes from early undergraduate poetry to the late criticism on reading biography and whatnot, and tries to make sense of the whole career in relation to thinking about censorship, institutional censorship, of course, but also cultural pressure and self-censorship. And it's a kind of tour de force of putting together the career of a great critic in an intelligent and sympathetic way. So anyhow, that should give you some sense of what the Burt team has produced. And this is, by the way, leaving out entirely all discussion of his poetry, which would be another 8 or 10 pages of CV in terms of books, chapbooks, readings, radio interviews, etc. So there's that. I'm just leaving out that side of the Stephen Burt collective entirely. It's obviously my great pleasure to now give you Stephen Burt, this single person standing in for the collective who must be producing all this work, and he's going to talk to us today about how to make an anthology and/or the literary history of the present.
Wow, thank you. I hope I am those people. I'm really honored. I owe a lot to this institution and to Richard and to the magazine that he edits and to a whole lot of other people who are in this room, including Mark Payne, who helped bring me here with classics, and to Hannah Brooks Modell and other people who are at different stages and who co-wrote one of the books that Richard mentioned a while ago and is now doing amazing work on other poets. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I am, in fact, several people. If you came to the reading last night, you know that I'm also called Stephanie. And if you know people who have unusual pronouns, who have changed their names, you may have been wondering what's going on with that. And the answer is that both he and she and Stephen and Stephanie, those are all correct for me. They all describe me. So don't worry about that. So I'm taking advantage of this unusually informed audience to give you a chimera, a talk with two heads. One head comes out of one big project that, am I audible, by the way? And think that was an amazing introduction. I really am all those people. I often feel like more than one person for more than one reason. I even write about that. I think Empson did too, but that's a different talk. So it's a talk with two heads, and one of the heads comes out of a project that I've now completed, and the other is about a project that is not quite done. And both of these heads sort of look back in different ways, and they're sort of weeping a bit, although she won't come up in the talk later, about the loss of C.D. Wright, who was central in different ways to both of these projects. And it's a huge shock not to have her alive and still writing. And I think if you had to pick one person who best represented the multi-headedness and the the multiple ways of regarding where American poetry is right now, she'd actually be the person I'd pick. And her career and the kinds of poems she's written represent, more than any other single poet's work can represent, the way that American poetry is a thing and not a thing, the way that it's very hard to cognize it right now as a whole. And that difficulty of thinking about American poetry, this difficulty of cognizing American poetry as one thing, or as one fully comprehensible set of things, really is the idea that starts off not just this talk, but that came out of finishing up the Cambridge History of American Poetry, which is more than 1,000 pages long. It has 48 contributors. Came out about a year ago. I was one of the 2 general editors, and I also wrote the last chapter about American poetry in the 1990s. The book stops in 2000, and Wright is one of the key figures in that chapter. And after the book sort of came back as this giant brick from Cambridge University Press, I had the occasion to reflect on the volume, which is starting to get reviews, and on the impossible dilemma that putting together the volume sort of posed, which is, what is this thing called American poetry? And has it become so big or so diverse that we can no longer say anything true and interesting about it as either a set of text or a unitary object of study? Is it an object of study when and only when we see it as a process in history or as a series of historical events rather than as a collection of fixed works of art? Is there an approach that lets us be literary critics about it without treating it inappropriately as if it were only one text or one project with one set of goals and one linear criterion of value? And the place I'm going to hope we all end up is that we should see, and that right now as practicing reviewers and critics and as academics, we run the serious risk of not seeing contemporary American poetry as a set of distinct aesthetic objects, each of which can be treated as a thing in itself, and there are lots and lots of them, and that we need to see both the diversity among them and the objects as things, in order to have a thing called contemporary poetry criticism, including literary history, that is at once intellectually consistent and ethically defensible and worth doing. So I want to get us to that position, but it'll take about half an hour. This talk has been called, pieces of it have been called, after the great cultural commentator John Oliver, "Is American Poetry Still a Thing?" It is also the introduction or the induction to a book called The Poem Is You, which was called, the subtitle was 50 Contemporary American Poems and How to Read Them. You'll see why it's no longer quite called that. So when John Oliver asks, how is this still a thing, on his wonderful television show, how is televangelism still a thing, or how is Columbus Day still a thing, he means that it shouldn't be a thing. The thing in question is now clearly useless or probably harmful. And I don't think American poetry is clearly useless or generally harmful. But I do wonder whether American poetry as a category seems obsolete, whether it's no longer coherent, and what we do about that. And these questions really became inescapable while we were putting together the Cambridge history, and while I got to look at the historiography of the term American poetry. Because this was the first big literary history to cover what we now understand as the whole field. The last time there was a multi-author major university press book of this kind was Jay Perini's Columbia History from 1993. For earlier periods, if you work on earlier periods of American poetry, or if you work on 17th and 18th century poetry, you sort of know what's coming. A lot of this bringing the project into the present involved going back and looking at the past and seeing what non-major authors or non-metropolitan authors or non-privileged authors had been left out of previous accounts, which is obviously worth doing. But that project has a logical stopping point only if you think you know how many poems there were, including poems by non-metropolitan or supposedly minor or neglected authors, and if you can physically read them all. And if you get past 1860 or maybe 1920 or maybe 1970, some point in the past, it turns out you can't physically read them all. It's not just that there's so much, it's that what there is has too little in common, and there are too many conflicting principles of selection available. And it's not just people whose tastes are my taste who feel like that. Carrie Nelson feels that way. This is Carrie Nelson in a volume that sort of competes with ours, writing last year. No matter how long you read and study and think, you will never fully master modern American poetry. The process of recovering occluded poems and poets, this is still Nelson, is by no means complete. Indeed, there is no longer any reason to think it ever will be. Ever. It's not just that so many books are out there from after a certain date. It's that there are so many standards and definitions for poetry that we have trouble asking not just what's a good poem or what is a successful poem, but also what is a poem. What do the poetry of James Merrill, Saul Williams, Mary Oliver, Juan Felipe Herrera, Lucille Clifton, Bernadette Mayer, Claudia Rankine, and Bruce Andrews, who are all successful according to some measure of success, have in common? And what about the poetry, if that is the right word, of Carla Harriman, Jenny Holzer, Brother Ali, Anna Karate, who you should check out, by the way, David Antin, Teresa Hak-Young Cha, and Jewel? Right? There are reasons to study all of those writers, but they're not always the same reasons. And just putting them in the same sentence shows how these are not just descriptive questions about how we already use that loaded and multivalent term poetry, but normative questions about how we have been told to use that word and how we would like to ask other people to use it. And they require judgments of merit. Different institutions have favored different kinds of answers. Pressures outside academia, in trade publishing and a lot of different kinds of book reviewing, and among most casual readers, usually favor clear definitions of easily interpretable things, things that can be sold or put on a tumbler or put into this year's Best American Poetry. But, as in the world of gallery art, pressure inside academia often now favors poetry that continues the modernist project of requiring that we ask, is this a poem? Work that tries, in Marjorie Perloff's words, to defamiliarize poetic material. And if you follow the British avant-garde, you know how much work that term material has done. To participate in a process, a debate, or an agon over the boundaries of art. And that's one reason why academics who work on contemporary American poetry have heard so much in the past 5 years about conceptualism versus flarf, and so little about Angie Estes, or Joseph Massey, or Alurista. Now, this controversy over whether poems are things we make or poetry is instead something we do itself animates single poems, and my favorite such poem is John Ashbery's poem called What is Poetry? I'll read you the middle of the poem. Beautiful images, trying to avoid ideas, as in this poem, but we go back to them as to a wife, leaving the mistress we desire. Now they will have to believe it as we believed it. In school, all the thought got combed out. What was left was like a field. Shut your eyes and you can feel it for miles around. And Ashbery's poem points to the many conflicting ways that we now conceive of poetry as defining a field, you might say a field of cultural production. Now, these conflicting or overlapping goals and definitions for the field of poetry can function whether we're discussing poetry from 1600 or from 2015 or from 1999. Now, there are other questions that show up if we're tracing American poetry diachronically. That is to say, if we become more self-conscious about how to write its literary history. In 1987, as many of you know, David Perkins completed his 2-volume history of modern poetry in English. He followed it up with a wonderful book called Is Literary History Possible? It's a fun book, and it's partly fun because his answer is nope. Why not? Well, once you reach a certain mass of text, a mass not reached, for example, by Anglo-Saxon, you are stuck in the hermeneutic circle. You have to decide what matters before you can figure out what it is that you are evaluating in order to decide where its boundaries lie and what part of it matters and for whom. As they emphasize some authors or texts rather than others, literary historians depend on qualitative judgments, but their methods provide no criteria, that's Perkins, and I would rather say no agreed upon criteria, but Perkins actually says no criteria for making such judgments. Now, that problem could vex any attempt to construct a literary history anywhere. There are other and more glaring problems specific to the history of modern American poetry. One of them is that we have in recent memory this goal of constructing the object now called American poetry, of claiming against counterclaims from abroad that it is important in the way that British or French poetry is important, and that whatever is special and important about it is also what makes it American. This goal extends back to the early national period, but it's really shaped the modern canon. This is not the kind of talk, perhaps unfortunately, that presents massive discoveries from a heretofore unknown archive. It is, I hope, a synthetic talk that says interesting things. But I did have the chance to go back and read a whole bunch of literary histories of American poetry from a while ago to see what they were saying, and they were saying things like this. This is from Columbia University professor Henry Wells in 1943. His literary history aims, quote, to define whatever is truly indigenous and unique in the American tradition itself. And that's what makes American poetry important for Henry Wells in 1943. And he used the word indigenous. He was not writing about Kiowa poets or Cherokee poets or Pueblo poets. Kenneth Lincoln in 1999 was. And his big argument about American poetry as a thing argues that there's something called American poetry, something else called American Indian poetry, and they are as distinctive objects of study in productive dialogue. And this book, called Sing with the Heart of a Bear, which some of you may know, includes a 12-page antiphonal opposition in which he treats each of these two ways of reading and objects of study as complementary. Roy Harvey Pierce's 1961 doorstop, The Continuity of American Poetry, claims that, quote, the Americanness of American poetry is quite simply its compulsive modernism, and asserts quite alarmingly that the strength of a poem registers the potential for communitas in the culture out of which it comes. You see the problem? That's actually literally fascist, isn't it? Albert Gelpi's very recent book, American Poetry After Modernism, which is not fascist, nevertheless argues that, quote, American art and literature proceed less on convention than on discovery, individuality, and difference. And again, for Gelpi, who is a very sensitive critic worth reading, Americanness is what makes poets new and individual, and individuality is what makes them American. And you see the problem here, I hope. This way of constructing American poetry as a thing and of judging it by its Americanness does not treat with adequate sympathy poems and poets who are trying to do something else, who are either critical of this project or just interested in other things, like Sarah Piatt, like Hazel Hall, arguably like Marianne Moore, and I'll come back to her. There are reasons why she seems central to me to a lot of contemporary American poetry in a way that was not true in 1992. This is Mary Leffelholtz, who puts the problem very crisply. For the last 100 years or more, the most reliable route to becoming canonical in American poetry has run through formal breaks with received Anglo-European poetic tradition, so that American poetry is by this definition other to British poetry. And Leffelholtz continues that we must then, if we believe that, say that because most of the poetry actually written and published in the 19th century United States would not pass any litmus test of formal estrangement from British verse, most American poetry is un-American. Yeah. One more literary history that used to be important and now is in 1974, Donald Stouffer's Short History of American Poetry. Stouffer begins this book by saying that American poetry is heterogeneous. It contains multitudes. It's a honking, great, diverse thing. But he found that he had to say something about it as a unified object of study with its own linear scale of value anyway. American poets are in the main anti-traditional, or at least forward-looking. That's Stouffer. And he concludes with a list of new black poets that includes both the publisher Dudley Randall and the South African expatriate Karapitsi Kagatsitsili, whose son is now much more famous than he is. Anyone know whose son? Earl Sweatshirt, thank you, yeah. Now, is Earl Sweatshirt an American poet? Yeah. There's no good way to answer that question without deciding what makes something poetry. Earl Sweatshirt's a rapper. And it was hard even in the 70s to claim American poetry was a thing with distinct boundaries. It's become harder not just because rap and other art forms that aren't for the page, but because America is a vexed concept, right? Americanists and American studies people who aren't poetry people have been very busy over the last 20 years taking apart the fences around the field. And we now know from them that there's no a priori reason to think a text from Florida in English or Spanish or both or neither has more in common with a text from Seattle than with one from Antigua or from Cuba. And there's certainly no a priori reason to think that a poem is better the more American it is. But we still have all these incentives institutionally to claim that American poetry is one thing. It's impossible entirely to get away from that. Too many sets of readerly and pedagogical and institutional and ultimately economic expectations say that we have to deal with what happens to fall in this frame. And certainly some American poets have been very happy to work with that frame, very happy to cognize American poetry as one thing. And in the past, I think that's been a defensible position. You can say that all the poetry from 1930 has something in common. And you can certainly say that American poetry in 2015 or 1995 is a collection of things, like the ornaments, boughs, and presents on and around a Christmas tree. That's how James Merrill thought of poetry, and it's how he thought of himself as he was dying in his great poem, Christmas Tree. Purple and silver chains, eavesdropping tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T. American poetry, and the self, indeed, the poet for Merrill, is a more or less diverse collection of representations, some apparently trivial, some almost wholly, around shared events, chosen and brought into shared private and semi-public spaces, where they might be, this is Merrill's word, shining, for a century or a day. And I'm going to come back to Merrill's Christmas Tree. I think that's the best figure we have for what American poetry is and how to collect it. But I want to notice first how even that approach, the idea that American poetry is a collection of objects like Christmas tree ornaments, how that approach can seem untenable. Pierce was even uncomfortable in the 60s with the idea that it was an object. Writing his introduction, he quoted Robert Frost's New Hampshire, where Frost says, "Me for the hills, where I don't have to choose." Along the same lines, there's Wallace Stevens' meditation on how we make our own personal anthologies, how we choose what we like. From Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, from the section, It Must Give Pleasure, Chico's smiling because he knows what's coming. He had to choose. But it was not a choice between excluding things. It was not a choice between, but of. He chose to include the things that in each other are included. The whole, the complicate, the amassing harmony. And that goal of universal inclusion as a conscious democratic choice, which is itself maybe an American goal, though not only an American goal, it's certainly a Whitman-esque goal. And it describes a wonderful mindset and an admirable aesthetic and not a possible model for all critical or editorial practice, right? Good luck amassing harmony and excluding nothing if you have a deadline and a word count and a page count and a permissions budget, God help us. Worse yet, if you choose, as Stevens and Pierce and these other past critics have chosen, to make many things seem to come together into one thing, one democratic thing called American poetry, you have chosen to leave the discordant, the minor, the not so obviously American things out. We don't have all the time in the world. We have trouble seeing American poetry as one thing, and we have trouble seeing it as a collection of objects where we choose the objects. And the solution that a lot of working critics and, in particular, academics have come to, and a lot of contemporary poets, practicing poets have come to, is to see American poetry instead as a process, as a series of events or a continuing event. Poets from the 20th century, poets who seem more important now than they did 20 or 40 years ago, are almost always poets who ask us to focus on process, on how or even when the writer made what she made. Look at Jack Spicer, right, with his Dictation from Mars. Look at Amiri Baraka, who is unavoidable at this point in thinking about poetry from the past few decades, whether you enjoy reading him or not, and whose later poetry insists that it is a series of actions in the service of a people, not a set of cold, dead, hard things, right? Or consider Bernadette Mayer, whose finished works sound unfinished, who have, in quoting Maggie Nelson, dedicated so much time and energy to the self-erasing tasks of collaborative and anonymous writing, and whose overriding statement of purpose might be her proclamation, you know this, work your ass off to change the language and don't ever get famous. Bernadette Mayer. Right, these are poets who emphasize process, and it's not a coincidence that they are more influential now than they were for much of their writing careers. Poetry now, especially outside the kind of trade press New York Review of Books FSG world, very often insists that we see it as a process, a way to participate in some individual or collective project that still has not reached its end and whose boundaries are quite hard to define. I understand that Rodrigo Toscano is going to speak or read or perform later tonight. He's as good an example as any. For reasons of time, and because I want not to take up all of your time, I'm not going to read you a poem by Hua Wen you know what, I'll read you the poem, but I won't discuss it. It's called A Story of History. You shall hear the story. You shall hear the story how Paul Paki was danced at Hiawatha's wedding. The student cried, hooray! The student cried, now you have it. I must have more light. I must have what I asked for. Your presence will not be necessary. I hope you can see how, like basically everything Hua Wen does, that does not present itself as a discretely bounded, tightly controlled aesthetic object, and how it's in dialogue with the way that we write literary history, including the reception history of Longfellow. And you can go through recent poets and find that some of the most interesting and strange and innovative ones are insisting on process in one or another way. I'll read you one more example. This is Latasha N. Nevada Diggs, who is also a video artist and a sort of sound artist. But she wrote a very interesting first book called Twerk. This is the start of one of the poems from Twerk. Dummy check, he's dummy, dummy, check, dummy, my song, check, dummy, check, ziplock, dummy, check. It looks like you're writing a letter. Would you like help? As serious as a hiccup. From LimeWire, I downloaded my Wonder Years. You cite my Prego, my Echo Sounder, my Sazon. I should have been a pop star. You said this, I know, I should have. I would have had a bubble by then. That is not my favorite first book of last year, but I think it's a very good book, and it's a very symptomatic book, in that Diggs is drawing together so many of the ways in which a poem can insist that it's not a thing, not stable, not an object, but a transformative performance that we should consider among other performances. Pop stars' performance of their own celebrity, pop music, concerts, correspondence privacy, instrumental music, freestyle rapping, and educational testing. Yeah, if you study the contemporary, you should know about Latasha and Nevada Diggs, whether or not you like her, and I do. Now, of course, we can find some awareness of process, of readers and their reception, of poetry as something that takes place in time, long before now, right? You guys know the beginning of Pope's epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, right? Shut the door, dear John. He's imagining that his poem takes place in real time. Think about Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium. Think about the Langston's use of Montage of a Dream Deferred, which has sound effects, right? Rebop, mop, yeah, it's used. But the sense of the history of poetry as the history of a multiply situated process, the sense that poems ask to be understood as ongoing processes, not as completed, separable objects, seems inescapable now, as it doesn't from most earlier periods, at least periods when there's print. And that sense of poetry as a process, I think, is being presented to us as a confrontational alternative to views of poems as things or sets of things, rather than, as in Yeats or in Pope, as the flip side of a wonderful coin. And in moving to a model of process, of poetry as interacting events, these poets are doing the same thing that a lot of present-day critics and scholars are doing. Nelson's Oxford Handbook is really about how the poetry has been used and transformed and how it's addressed the subject it addresses, and that's why it's organized by topic rather than by poet. Charles Altieri was arguing in the 90s that the most important contemporary poetry was stressing its, quote, resistance to artifactuality. That's Altieri's term. Michael Davidson, who's using some of the same language of appreciation as Altieri, has praised Barrett Watton for utilizing the performative as a discursive arena. Mike Chassar, whose work you may know, has been emphasizing how verse gets used and for whom, whether that verse is by listeners to John Ciardi's radio shows, or by William Carlos Williams, or by the uncredited writers at Burmashave. I could go on. So many ways to do the history of poetry right now and to evaluate contemporary poetry are emphasizing its status as process and as events and interactions. And this attitude has a lot to recommend it. It seems democratic. It does justice to the ways in which the writing of poetry is always collaborative. It involves poets and imagined readers, as well as poets and editors and publishers. And a review of poetry as an event, as a process, also makes critics sound more reflective and more self-conscious about what we do than all those book reviewers who are always telling you what to read, or worse yet, what you should already have read. Right? You know the joke, how many indie rockers does it take to change a light bulb? Does anyone know that joke? How many indie rockers does it take to change a light bulb? No. The answer is, you mean you don't know? Yeah. And if you tell that joke, you're that guy. And critics, for ethical reasons as well as reasons of sort of personal style, we don't want to be that guy. And it is a guy, this is gender as well. And these are all separately interesting and valid reasons why critics and poets have both recently been trying to emphasize poetry as a process and event rather than poems as objects. And that's fine, but I've come to think, and I'm sort of here to say, that we've gone too far. Poetry does look like a process in all these ways, and other ways, like if you study drafts and revisions. But if you look at poetry, neither from the sort of longue durée, nor from the moment-by-moment process of revision, if you look at why we have poetry in the first place and why we go to it, I think you have to be able to see poems as separate, discrete, bounded objects as well. Individual poems are what most poets work to make, they're what readers exchange, and they are the reasons that the institutions of poetry have formed as they have, most of them. Individual poems are less like the grit in oysters than like the live animals that make the coral that is the institutions and the literary history whose edifices we are studying. They're less like theatrical performances most of the time, even now, than they are like sheet music, or even like memorized sheet music. We carry their performances in our heads. We may discuss poems in groups, but we read them if we are really reading them one at a time. And the same critics who present themselves most vigorously as historians, impelled by documentary and by ethical imperatives to see everything in its context in time, who are telling you to always historicize, to see everything as an intervention, those same critics are still constructing what used to be called a canon of poets and of individual poems. And there are poems that insist that they're processes, but there are also poems like this one by University of Chicago alum, I believe, the Dutch-American poet Alyssa Vallis. I'm going to read you a stanza of hers. I admire the startling new voice and the linguistic tour de force, but how about something to read before an operation? How about a few lines to engrave on a ring or a stone? We are looking for that ring. We should allow ourselves to look for that ring. It's okay if you don't like direct analogies between political change and literary history. I don't think we all have to make them. Our profession often asks us to make them, and if you like making them, or if you hang out with people who make them, you should be troubled by the way that we have become used to talking about subversion and instability and attention to process as if they were always good and good for the left. It is at least as plausible that when we hold up instability and malleability and embeddedness in process as the goals for new poems or new critical studies, we are contributing to the culture of disruptive innovation, of creative destruction on which we're told a neoliberal order depends. The language by which we are told to suspend judgments about individual poems and just try to say what they've done in the past or how they interact with their audiences in the present can resemble the language used by history department historians, but it can also resemble the language of the invisible hand in which markets whatever they do are right. And the language by which we praise poems for their openness to process or for their subversion can sound a lot like the language of startups and angel investors who are looking for a more interactive Poetry 2.0. The more political and ethical you want to be about your own tastes, the more you should be worried about the neoliberal implications of the language of process that tells us that Spicer is always right and Marianne Moore is wrong. It's really, whether or not you like using that ethically charged language, it should not be the only language you use. Now, I'm not arguing that poems are or should always be in some strong metaphysical sense real things or real things of the same kind. I am arguing that we need to retain a point of view in which we see poems as real, separable, bounded, and therefore collectible things, alongside the frames that sees poetry as a series of events or a process. It is in their ways of being things that most poems distinguish themselves from most other objects of cultural and historical analysis. They are or can be peculiarly durable things, some of them last thousands of years, made of nothing but words. And it's what they do to and for us as separable things that we can reread or memorize or look at from the front and from behind that poems might justify the attention that we have historically given them, more attention, whether or not they are American, than we usually give restaurant menus or telegrams, even though poems, like restaurant menus and telegrams, are also parts of processes. And to treat poems as objects worthy of collecting and regarding as objects, we don't need to believe anything in particular about the large and never uncontroversially defined set of objects to which the one phrase American poetry refers. We don't. We don't need to agree on a definition of American poetry. We need to believe that American poetry can usefully refer to some large set of objects that can never be fully enumerated, but whose members can be examined one by one. Robert Meyer Lee has recently written that to study literature means to study the acts of valuing that register a text as literary. And to study those acts, I'd add, is also to perform them. And we should feel okay about performing them. We don't need to just record what literary history has already done to the objects of our study. We already are the people who are doing it. We make this history by doing criticism in a way that's not true for the history of Congress or of shoes. And when we give reasons for liking what we like, reasons that other people might also like it, we should not restrict ourselves to the overtly ethical, to the language of subversion, nor to evidence of existing influence. I'm going to end with Auden, I think. There's a lot more to say about how I have been choosing the objects that I have myself been choosing for this book called The Poem Is You, which has more than 50 poems in it now. But I'll end with Auden. Some books are undeservedly forgotten. No books are undeservedly remembered. Part of our job involves trying to get individual poems remembered. And if we don't do that for some poems, no one else will. I'll stop there.